What were the cultural implications of the Enlightenment? Although some may claim the Enlightenment had no cultural implications, and it was merely a shift to more rational thinking, the Enlightenment had multiple important cultural implications. What were these? Well, the Enlightenment shaped ideas about our physical world, it transformed perspectives on philosophy and the arts, and it transformed social behavior and how we view hierarchy. Let us start by looking at how it shaped our views of the physical world. And probably the best example of this is with Isaac Newton. Now, Isaac Newton is probably best remembered for his work with both discovering how gravity works and founding calculus. And regardless of whether or not you like calculus, you have to admit that this was a huge, important discovery in math and very rational. However, Newton was more than just an Enlightenment thinker. In fact, he really wasn't one. He was much more of a person that was still of the old school of thought, except in a few small areas. As John Keynes puts it, quote, Newton was not the first of the age of reason, he was the last of the magicians. When Newton wasn't proving angels weren't pushing the stars around, he was busy working on alchemy, trying to brew the elixir of life or chasing after the philosopher's stone. These were far from the rational thoughts that were around the Enlightenment. But even still, his work with gravity shows that the Enlightenment was changing his way about the way he viewed the physical world. But perhaps we should take a look at a true Enlightenment thinker, René Descartes. Now, René Descartes is best known for his saying, I think, therefore I am. He was trying to use this to build a foundation of self-knowledge to prove his Christianity. He was a devout believer, and he wanted to use reason and his understanding of the physical world to enhance, not replace, his faith. He, like all the other thinkers of the Enlightenment, wanted reason and the Enlightenment to be a way to better understand their faith in the world around them. They were using their ideas of reason to better understand the physical world. This was a huge cultural implication, even if it was not necessarily even if it somewhat transformed into reasons they did not want later on. But this was far from the only cultural ramification of the Enlightenment. Another was it transformed the way they viewed philosophy and the arts. And perhaps one of the most important ways was in their music. And we can see this through Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, Bach had a very clear and very Enlightenment thoughts when he came to music. He said that the goal, aim, and final end of all music should be the glory of God and the refreshment of the soul. And so how would he go about doing this, using his rational Enlightenment thinking? Well, he would write very technical pieces of work, such as his crab canon. Now, the crab canon might not seem that interesting at first, because when you play it normally, it's just rather bland, normal piece of music. But it becomes somewhat more impressive when you play it backwards, or perhaps upside down, or perhaps normally backwards and upside down all at once, and it still sounds good. By applying his rational thinking to music, he was able to write a technical piece that did more than just sound good, and instead show how reason could be applied to music. But music was not the only area. in which we can see the cultural impact of the Enlightenment. It can also be found in architecture. Now, the architecture of this time was frequently large and white, and more often than not, straightforward. Think, for example, of the White House. On the outside, although not poorly constructed, it's not bright and colorful. It's built to serve a purpose. You can see how the reasoning, there's reason in the Enlightenment thinking being applied towards it. As such, it becomes quite clear how the Enlightenment had a cultural impact of it shaping philosophy and the arts. But it also changed one more thing, and that is social behavior and how people viewed hierarchy. Now, this is perhaps the most important reason because of how different it changed the governments and all. Now, before this time, before the Enlightenment, people had just gone with traditions. Think, for example, of the common law. Judges basically just made up the rules as they went along because that's what worked best. If somebody committed a crime, you would punish them accordingly. If someone did something that just was wrong, but there wasn't a previous law written, you would still punish them just as you saw fit. But in the age of reason, these traditions and the practice of common law were being questioned. And as a result, there were two main philosophies that emerged. It was Kantian deontology versus Bensonite consequentialism. Now, in the Kantian deontology, it said the ethically relevant feature of an act was the motive. What are you trying to accomplish by doing something? If you give a homeless man $20 so that he can get some food and perhaps somewhere to stay for the night, then that's a good act because you had the right motive. Your basic value is autonomy, and you need to be respecting others as your ethical imperative. But the Bensonite consequentialism disagreed. If, for example, you gave this homeless man $20 and he went on to buy drugs with it, then that was clearly wrong, as we are judging an act by its consequences. However, for example, if you were to go murder somebody and that person would have become the next Hitler, then of course what you did was right because, judging by the consequences, we achieved the best outcome. Our ethical imperative is not merely for respect, it's to promote overall pleasure and happiness. Not just necessarily of yourself, but of the general population. As such, we need to evaluate choices from an empirical point of view. What is the end result? So, going back to our example of our homeless man, the end result of him spending it on drugs is bad, therefore your act is bad. But from our Kantian deontology, our choices are evaluated from our chooser's point of view. You giving that man $20 to do good means that it is the right thing. Now, these two conflicting ideologies still both prove the same point, that we cannot just go on accepting tradition as our basis for law and the way social behavior works. We need to apply reason to find the true way it works. But perhaps there was something more important than just evaluating social behavior. It is how you raise your children to have this social behavior. As Emile Rousseau puts it, the noblest work in education is to make a reasoning man, and we expect to train a young child by making him reason. End quote. They have placed a huge importance on education so that everyone would grow up to be a reasoning person. But there is one last area of social behavior that we must look at, and hierarchy that we must look at, as it was influenced by the Enlightenment, and that is with feminism. Now, before this period in time, women had been largely disregarded. But now, thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft said that if we are to apply reason to everything, why should we not apply reason to the way we view women? After all, what objective reason proves that we are inferior to men? As such, she began and became one of the first major advocates for women's rights. So overall, from shaping ideas about the physical world to transforming perspectives on the arts, and to transforming social behavior and how we view hierarchy, the cultural impact and implications of the Enlightenment cannot be understated. This was far more than a simple shift to a more rational school of thought.